Embalmers. The woman who died alone. Today, we will talk about paranormal events that occur in morgues, inexplicable things that happen to the workers in this place, and even more astonishingly, to the corpses manipulated in these sites. If you have the stomach and composure to handle these events, congratulations, you are in the right place. Get comfortable and enjoy, alone or with the following terrifying tales we have for you. Let's begin. Case 1. The woman who died alone. I had been working in that morgue for 6 years and had never seen or felt anything abnormal, although many of my colleagues always recounted chilling experiences that happened to them whenever they worked. However, when I heard my colleagues' stories, I usually laughed because it seemed to me that they couldn't quite get used to working with corpses. Today, I will recount something that changed my perspective and way of thinking. It was past midnight when we received a rather disturbing case. My assistant and I were exhausted after performing more than 3 autopsies. But when we least expected it, a woman around 60 years old arrived. I will never forget that early morning. It all happened on the night of October 24th, an extremely cold night. In fact, the air conditioning had to be turned down as low as possible to work. Truth be told, something like that had never happened before. And as for my assistant, he couldn't take it for long and ended up leaving me alone on that cold and lonely night, locked in 4 tightly enclosed walls with a cold and rigid corpse in the worst condition. When the woman arrived at the morgue, they placed her on the metal table. My first reaction was to approach her, and it was then that I was horrified when I removed the sheet covering her body. I couldn't help but step back. Hundreds of maggots were crawling out of a large part of the woman's decaying body, mainly from her ears, mouth, nose, and eyes. The clothing she was wearing was dirty and torn. In all my years working in the morgue, I had never dealt with a case like this. I couldn't help but vomit 3 times in a row, and my body was sweating like never before. I have to admit I was scared, but I had to do my job. Reading the woman's report, I realized what she had gone through. She was found lifeless in her home, and her decaying odor led to the discovery. Several neighbors had reported it, and they also mentioned that the woman had been living alone for over 20 years. They never knew any family members, and she didn't associate with anyone. So, I acted differently when I saw that she had passed away naturally, but very sadly since she had no relatives, let alone any close neighbors. I made the report and personally transported her to the hospital's crematorium. However, upon returning to the morgue, I felt a strange sensation as if I were being watched. My gaze frantically scanned the entire place, but I couldn't see anything. I attributed it to the nervousness still coursing through my body, as the lifeless body of that woman was still there. It was 3 in the morning when I looked at the clock on the wall, so I decided to lie down for a moment, hoping to rest and relax a bit. In the break room, I must have fallen asleep for about 15 minutes when a loud noise startled me awake. My heart raced a mile a minute. I went to the morgue's main room, and again, that feeling of being watched overwhelmed me. The cold was horrendous, and suddenly, I felt the need to look at the metal table. What I saw horrified me to the point where my lips trembled, as did my teeth, which I couldn't stop from chattering. You might think it was because of the cold, but it wasn't. It was because of what my eyes were witnessing. The body I had taken to the crematorium half an hour ago was now sitting up, but there was a strange force pulling its face left and right, as if it were a puppet. Its head turned in an unnatural way, and that wasn't all. I noticed pieces of flesh falling onto the cold metal table. I was completely paralyzed, and even more so when spine-chilling noises came from its decaying mouth. Suddenly, the morgue's door swung open, producing the most deafening noise I've ever heard in my life. I couldn't help but let out a scream of terror that erupted from my throat, shaking everything. Seconds later, my assistant came running, asking me what had happened. I could only point a trembling finger toward the table. To my surprise, when I looked back to where the woman had been, there was nothing. That elderly lady was exactly as we had left her, ready for the cremation procedure. That night was the longest I've ever experienced in the morgue. I ended up not telling anyone, not even my assistant. Even to this day, I don't know what happened to me that day. Anyone in my shoes would have left and never returned, but I still continue working. However, there are nights when I sense that I am still being watched, but I no longer make an effort to find out who it is because, as they say, he who seeks shall find. Case 2. The Pact of the Old Woman. Hello, my name is Cassandra. I worked at a hospital where very strange things happened, especially in the freezer area where we kept the bodies for a few hours until the funeral services came to collect them. When I first arrived at that morgue, I felt that something was not normal. I had worked in many places and different funeral homes in my life, but the atmosphere in that morgue felt very heavy. Honestly, I didn't feel comfortable in that place. I had heard so many terrifying stories about that site that I didn't know whether to believe them or not. My colleagues used to say that the dead would rise at 3 in the morning. Others claimed that you might encounter an old woman wandering the hallway, or you would simply hear the dead talking to each other. To me, these things were just tales. Throughout my career, I had never witnessed anything that truly left me breathless, even though I had always worked the night shift. According to some, it's during this shift that more supernatural occurrences happen, or souls wander throughout the place. On one occasion, they assigned me an assistant who was doing her practical training for university. But it was the worst experience. She seemed very distracted, hardly stayed with me, frequently left without notice, didn't talk much, left me alone for several hours when she was supposed to be learning the trade. When she returned, she claimed she was doing other tasks that were not her job or things I didn't instruct her to do. Frankly, I was quite annoyed because her job was supposed to be assisting me and learning, not doing other things. I didn't say anything to her since the next day I would bring in my assistant, the one I had worked with for many years. The funeral home director had already accepted the change, and it was just a matter of time before I replaced this girl who was only causing me more trouble. That night, it was already past 2:30 in the morning when my assistant, the distracted girl, left. I asked her where she was going, and she told me that it was almost time. I was puzzled because it was perhaps the time for her to take a break or rest a bit, as I didn't know much about her. I let her go and stayed behind to fill out some forms. I was working on the report of a girl who had died in a hit-and-run accident when I checked the time, and it was already 2:49. I don't know why, but the stories they had told me about that place came to mind. I let out a sigh. I was tired, so I covered the body with a sheet and prepared to rest for a couple of minutes. It took me a while to gather my things, and as I did, I heard someone approaching or walking down the hallway. I thought it was my assistant, but she never appeared again. I couldn't help but think about the old woman who roamed the hallway. I was afraid of encountering her, and even though I didn't believe much in such things, fear overcame me. I jumped when my watch sounded, indicating that it was already 3 in the morning. Without giving it much thought, I decided to leave that place. Despite being accustomed to working with the deceased, I didn't like the idea of taking naps in front of an inert body. I was about to do so when suddenly the lights went out. A sense of terror washed over my entire body, and I began to hear voices, diabolical laughter from all around. I turned on the flashlight on my phone, and what I saw left me frozen. All the bodies I had prepared to be handed over to their families were sitting on their tables. I almost fainted. I wanted to leave that place, but my body didn't respond. For a few seconds, I watched as the bodies talked among themselves, and my heart began to race. All I remember is that my breathing sped up, and suddenly my vision blurred. After that, I didn't know anything else. The next day, I woke up in one of the hospital rooms, and no one asked me what had happened. It seemed like everyone already knew what I had seen. Later, one of the doctors, the most senior one in the hospital, arrived, and without asking me anything, he said, "I know what you saw." He warned me, "Don't ever stay alone downstairs in the morgue again." Then he began to tell me the hospital's story. A while ago, a seriously ill elderly woman came to the hospital. No one knew what was wrong with her as she underwent several tests, and they found nothing, but she looked really bad. She spent a few nights in this hospital, and on every one of those nights, she screamed not to let her die. One early morning, at exactly 3 in the morning, the elderly woman went to the hospital's morgue and with a scalpel, she disemboweled one of the pathologists and one of his assistants, from what I heard. The old woman had made a pact with the devil to save her granddaughter, who suffered from an incurable disease. When she committed the crime, the old woman was already dead. And the one who disemboweled the doctors was the devil himself, who used the old woman's body. That's why at 3 in the morning, the devil comes to play with the dead, makes them talk, and even causes them to rise or converse with each other. That's what the doctor told me when I woke up from my fainting spell. They had told me these things, but I didn't believe them. And the most chilling part comes next. When I asked about the name of the young assistant who had been assigned to me, they didn't answer me. They remained silent, looking at each other. And when they told me the truth, my heart rate began to rise again. They told me the following: "There is no assistant here." "What do you mean?" "She was a distracted girl who left me alone sometimes and hardly ever spoke," I replied, quite nervous. The doctor then told me, "If I were you, I wouldn't go back to that morgue. The girl you're talking about is probably the same demon we're discussing, the one who used the old woman's body as a vessel. Be very careful if you ever see her again." "It is impossible," I immediately replied. "She was with me almost the whole night." Before leaving, the doctor responded, "Perhaps this hospital and its morgue have been haunted or cursed since that day, as the old woman and the demon who disguises themselves as assistants or patients continue to roam that place." With that said, the doctor left the room, and I pondered what to do next. What I had seen had traumatized me, so I didn't want to go back. In a hospital in my city, they need a forensic doctor who has the courage to work past 3 in the morning, and they are still waiting in case you want to give it a try. Case 3. The Golden Ring. Hello, good evening, friends of Dark Secrets. My name is James, I'm an embalmer, and I have a truly shocking horror story. I was in the autopsy room, and it was nearly 9 in the evening when they brought in a deceased person, a young woman of about 20. They only told me that she was a substance abuser and that she probably died from an overdose. I thought about what's happening with the youth nowadays as I began to examine the body. I noticed she had a ring on one of her fingers, but I didn't pay much attention to it. I started to do my job and write the report, which took me about 2 hours. To make matters worse, I was alone because my assistant had fallen ill and the replacement didn't show up. Everything was going normally until I realized that she no longer had the ring on her finger. I thought, what on earth? I checked her other hand, but it wasn't there either. So, I searched the floor, thinking it might have fallen off. After searching for a while, I found it next to the table. I was about to pick it up when I felt that something was watching me or accompanying me from the darkest corner of the morgue. I felt a presence behind me, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't overcome the fear. Without thinking, I ran out because I had never experienced anything like that before. My biggest mistake was picking up the ring and taking it with me. I didn't want to tell anyone about this strange event. Surely, no one would believe me. The next day, I felt better and had almost forgotten about what happened that night. I entered the morgue again and sighed in relief when I saw that they had already taken the body of that young woman. I put on my lab coat and some gloves to continue my work with other bodies. I reached into the coat pocket and felt something, and there was the ring. Due to the fright I had experienced the previous night, I had completely forgotten that I had placed it there. I didn't know what to do because I didn't know where the woman from that night lived to return it to her family. That's how the day went by, but I felt like someone was following me. I didn't pay much attention to it, and luckily, this time, I wasn't alone. It was 11 at night, and my shift had ended, and I was about to leave when my assistant screamed. I rushed in to see what had happened and found him lying on the ground with a pale face. I called the others to take him away and asked him to explain what had happened. He simply said that he had seen a girl asking him for a ring. That night, I couldn't sleep. Unfortunately, I had that ring, but I didn't know how to return it. So, I began investigating where that girl lived. It took me a week to find the house. During that whole week, the girl kept showing up in the living room, asking for the ring. She had us all terrified at the funeral home. Eventually, I reached the house. It looked somewhat abandoned. I knocked, and an elderly lady came out. I asked her about the girl, and she told me that since her family had died, she had moved to another house far from there. I asked if she knew where they were, but she couldn't give me an answer. I walked away from the house somewhat disappointed because I needed to find out where the girl was buried to leave the ring there. It was the only way to get rid of it. And so, after investigating with my colleagues at the funeral home, I managed to locate her remains. I went to the cemetery to find her grave. It was nearly 3 in the afternoon, and I spent over an hour searching among all the fresh graves. Fortunately, I found it. Without thinking, I left the ring and walked away without saying anything. But something disturbing stopped me. Next to the girl's grave, there was a photo, the same lady I had spoken to just a couple of days earlier, Sophia Williams, 1949 to 2020. I was puzzled. I went back to the house to see if I could find the lady, but I knocked, and no one came out. I was about to leave when a man asked me why I was knocking insistently on that door. The man told me, "No one has lived in that house for a week." "It can't be," I replied. "Just a few days ago, a lady came out, and we were talking. I'm sorry to tell you, young man, but you are mistaken. The only person who lived here was the owner's daughter, an elderly woman who passed away a couple of years ago. Since then, her only daughter took refuge in substance abuse. The poor girl didn't last long and died a couple of weeks ago." "Indeed, sir, she is the one I'm looking for," I replied, "but what you're telling me is truly terrifying. I am an embalmer and work at the funeral home that received the young woman you're talking about. I personally prepared the girl's body, and from what you're saying, I was in front of the woman who was her mother just a couple of days ago, both of them already dead. Fortunately, I was able to return the ring, and I want to believe it was the last gift her mother gave her, the last memory she had of her. That's why she insisted on having it back. Since that day, I knew I would have to get used to these kinds of strange circumstances at the funeral home. I've talked to colleagues who have worked in hospitals and different morgues, and they have completely shocking stories. We have agreed that many of the spirits of the deceased often don't realize they have passed away and sometimes appear from time to time. These are situations that are undoubtedly completely terrifying. Thank you for listening to me, and I send a warm embrace to all my colleagues in New York.